All right, today we are diving into a full tutorial. We are going to be painting on a 4-inch plaster made rock that I got from the Rock Shop Co. on Etsy. This is how it looks without the paint, and as you can see, it has the center marked, which makes it super easy. And I sometimes just it has a little raised dot, so I just like to pick it off, and now I can see it better. And our first dot will cover that up anyways. So I painted this black last night using Folk Art multi-surface satin in pure black. So this is my go-to for base paint. I use it for small items all the way up to my large mandalas, and I've used it for years. I prefer a multi-surface paint for the base. Multi-surface paint is made to adhere to more surfaces. This is also indoor, outdoor, so it's just a little bit more durable. I had someone reach out the other day who was painting a plaster item like this. Plaster is really, really smooth, and they used, it was a non-multi-surface paint as the base, and when they went to do the guide marks, the pencil was ripping up the base paint. So I recommended that they try a multi-surface, and that helped the issue. So I definitely recommend using a multi-surface or an outdoor paint for your base. Okay, and now we are going to draw on the guide marks. I'm going to be using the 16-point mandala stencil from Happy Dotting Company. And I'm just placing that right over the center. And I am just drawing out these vertical guide marks. Okay, and now we're going to do the circular guide marks. Okay, so now we have our guide marks. If there's any areas that you want to show up a little bit more, you can just go over them a bit. But for the most part, they look pretty good. So as a beginner, I definitely recommend using some type of guide marks. So one of the issues that I hear about the most from beginners is spacing, just having issues getting everything spaced nice and evenly. So this should really solve that problem using guide marks. And as we go through this tutorial, I'll show you how we use them. But if you have spacing issues, absolutely use guide marks. Freehanding mandalas is really hard. And that is actually how I learned. I didn't use guide marks for the first, I don't know, probably 6 months of painting. And I just freehanded everything, and I actually learned a lot from that process. But as soon as I started using guide marks, my art went to a whole new level. So I definitely recommend using some type of guide marks. It just keeps everything symmetrical and all in line. Okay, so now our stone is ready, and we are just going to mix up the paint. And these are the colors I will be using: DecoArt Americana, Sour Apple, Peacock Teal, Lavender, and Royal Fuchsia. And I also will be using this pearl as an accent. This is DecoArt Dazzling Metallic White Pearl. One of my favorite pearl colors. I use this as an accent color a ton. That's why it's in this pot, because I use it all the time. Okay, so I'm just going to use this color straight out of the bottle. So I am just now thinking of the order that I want them to go in. So picking colors is just sometimes kind of a random decision. I'm gonna start with blue. So Peacock Teal. And our dotting rods. And I just need to think about what size I want this to be. So I want a large center dot, but not too big. So I'm going to use this size 13. And you want a lot of paint on your tool, especially for the center dot. So you can see about how much I dip in there. So you want to make sure you don't just want to like dip just on the tip of your tool. You want to really get it in there. And again, lift up your tool and underneath, make sure there's like a string of paint. You want a lot of paint, especially for the center dot because it is a larger dot. If you don't have enough paint, it can look more uneven. So we are just doing our best to get that right over the center, and I'm just doing a couple of those tapping motions or hovering. And then as you can see, there's a little ripple there. So I'm going to get even more paint and just hover over the top until we get a nice mound. So next I'm going to do a ring of dots going around this dot, which is a really popular technique in mandala painting. So I'm going to take the pearl color and I'm going to do the small end of the pink stylus tool. And I'm just going to start creating a ring of dots going around the blue center dot. So we just want to do our best to make these all the same size. And we want to get the ring of dots, you want the dots to be close to one another without touching, and then as close to the center dot without touching it. Because if the paint touches, it'll run together. And we are just going to do this all the way around. I do not count these dots. I've seen other artists who use the guide marks to make like a certain amount of dots, but I don't do that. I find that to be a little stressful, so I just start the row of dots and try to get them all the same size going all the way around, and then as we get to the end, I'll show you how we get the last few dots to line up. So if you notice your dots are getting progressively bigger, it could be because the paint starts to build up on the tool. So if that's happening, then you'll just want to wipe your tool off and then keep going. So then as you start to get towards the end, you can just eyeball, let's see, about 1, 2, 3, 4. I could probably fit about 4. I might need to make them a little smaller to fit. Or you can do the opposite. You can make them a little bit bigger to fit. And let's see, 1. So I feel like a couple more will be a tight squeeze. I was gonna fit 3 more right there. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm just gonna wipe up this last dot. And instead of trying to squeeze in 4 dots, I'm going to maybe space them out a little bit more and just do 3 instead. So I think that will probably be a better fit than trying to squeeze 4 dots. So as you get towards the end, just depending on the space that you have, you can either make the dots a little bit smaller to squeeze more, or you can make them a little bit bigger to do a couple less. But yeah, that's how I do my ring of dots. I try not to stress out too much about them meeting at the end. You can always use a Q-tip to wipe up a dot and kind of adjust the spacing to make them a little bit farther apart or closer together. But yeah, I used to stress about those and trying to get them to like fit perfectly, and that just stressed me out. So I try not to do that anymore. Okay, next I'm going to do the green colors, so sour apple. And I'm going to do another ring of dots. So when you do the second ring, we're gonna try to go in between each dot from the previous row. So sometimes, depending on how your spacing is looking, you can use the same size tool that you used in the previous row to go in between, or if they're a little bit more spaced out, you might need to go up a size for your next row to avoid having a bunch of gaps. But since this is so small, I think that I can just use the same small end of the pink tool. So I'm using, well, let's see, we'll test it out and see how the spacing is. So if you're trying to go in between each dot from the previous row, so there's little gaps in between, but it's nothing crazy. So I will keep this size tool. If you have really wide gaps, then you might need to go up in size to fill in those gaps a little bit more. So we're just placing the green dot in between each dot from the previous row. And you'll see me do like these tapping motions. That unloads more paint off the tool and makes a bigger dot. So that is one way that you can control the amount of paint and how big your dots are. So I'll typically pick like a smaller tool and then use that tapping method to make the dots a little bit bigger, depending on the size space that I have to fill. So next, let's see. I am going to do some larger dots now. And I'm just kind of looking at these guide marks and seeing what size tool I want to use. I'm going to use the purple next. So the lavender. And I'm going to be doing some dots, but let me think. I'm just thinking of spacing. I want to do a dot on every other guide mark and then be able to do a swoosh in between. But right now, actually that looks fine. So that's what we'll do. I'm going to use this size 6 tool. And I'm going to make a dot on every other vertical guide mark. So we have 16 points. We used a 16-point stencil. So if we're skipping every other vertical guide mark, then we will have 8 large dots. And this is how we can keep everything nice and evenly spaced by using the guide marks. Okay, so now we have our 8 dots. And now I'm going to use the pink. Oh, you can see it was a little runny. It had that liquidy layer on top because I haven't used this one in a while, so it needs to be mixed up. Okay, now I'm going to use the large end of the green stylus tool, so it has a large end, and I'm going to make a dot right in between these purple dots, and then I'm going to flip the tool over and use a small end to make a swoosh. So if you have a different set of stylus tools, then you just want to grab one that has a larger end to make a larger dot, and then a smaller tool that has a small end to drag your swoosh down. So I'm making it right in between, and then I'm using the smaller end. And these are really short swooshes, so I'm grabbing the paint for the tail right at the end. So these ones you don't want to grab paint from like the top or the middle because it'll be too thick. You want a really nice point, so you're just grabbing a little bit of paint from the bottom of the circle and doing a small little tail. So again, making a large dot, and then we're just grabbing a tiny bit of paint from the bottom of the circle to do a really small, short swoosh. Perfect. And now I'm going to use the same dotting rod, so the size 6, I think we used. And I'm going to make a dot on top of each pink swoosh. So those pink swooshes are all on a vertical guide mark. So now we're going to make a dot just on that same vertical guide mark. And I'm going to use the blue. So I'm dotting right above the pink swoosh and on that same vertical guide mark, keeping everything nice and in line. Okay, so now with mandalas, you start in the center and you work outward, and the farther out you go, the more spaces that you're gonna have in between. So now this gap that we have between the blue dots is a lot bigger than the gap we had between the purple. So now we need to add more to this pattern to fill in the gap. So what we're gonna do is take the pearl and the, let's see, small end of the pink stylus. And again, there's a vertical guide mark going right through the center of this blue dot. And that's where we want to start our first dot, is right on that guide mark. And then we're going to walk the dots down along the edge of the blue dot. Like that. So dotting on the vertical guide mark and then walking the dots down until you either run out of paint or just get to the bottom there. So we are starting to create a flower petal shape. So as I'm looking at this pattern, I just kind of build patterns as I go. There is like a bit of a gap here on the purple ones that we did. So if yours is gappy like mine, like there's a big gap between the purple and the pink, you could, if you wanted, do some walking the dots in that little gap. If you don't have that much of a gap, then you can just leave it as is, but I kind of want to fill that in. So normally you would do these walking the dots before you did the pink swoosh, but in this case, I noticed the gap after, so we are just going to go with the flow and add it in. And also you could be using the same exact tools as me, and your sizes and spacing might be a little different. So you might have enough space to do these like I'm doing now, or maybe your gap was filled okay with just that swoosh. Making mandalas is kind of like putting together a puzzle, and you're just trying to see what patterns and what pieces fit where to fill in the black space. So this is a good example of using a pattern that we know to fill in a space that was looking a little bit empty. And I think that ended up looking a lot better. So I'm just kind of looking at the spacing. As you're building the mandala, you want to figure out how to fill in the gap in between your petal patterns. So a good way to do that is to just keep doing more rings. We didn't do a ton of swooshes in our basic pattern video that we did in the beginner series. You could do some like little swooshes to fill in the gaps here, but I think for this one I kind of want to keep it more to dots. So what we're going to do is we'll take the green, and I'm going to go up to the large end of the pink stylus, and we are just going to make a dot. And if you want, you can dot again into the paint and then walk the dots down. So we are just kind of using the simple patterns that we went over in the basic patterns video of this series. So we still have a bit of a large gap right here. So I'm going to do one more set of these walking the dots. But for the last row, I want to do a larger dot at the tip and then a smaller one walking down. So I'm going to use let's see, I want to do pink. So I'm using the large end of the white tool, and I'm going to make a larger dot at the tip. Color placement is typically pretty random, just what you feel would look best next. I wish there was more of like a formula for that, but there really isn't. Okay, now I'm going to take the large end of the pink tool, so I'm going down to a smaller tool. And I'm just going to walk the dots down. So this kind of creates a flower petal shape. Okay, and now we are going to do some more swooshes, kind of like the pink ones that we did, but a little bit bigger. So I'm going to use the large end of the green stylus, and I'm going to make a dot, and I want the dot to line up with the tips of the petals. So I'm going to make a large dot, and then I'm going to flip the tool over and use the small end to drag down. So I'm just thinking about colors. I think I want purple, because I haven't used purple in a minute, and then maybe, I don't know, maybe pearl? Maybe we do a pearl one first and then purple, or purple then pearl. Let's do pearl first. So I'm going to use the pearl color, large end of the green stylus, making a dot right in between, and there is a vertical guide mark here, so we are just going to drag this down along that vertical guide mark. Now we're going to do that same thing, but with the purple. So I'm using the same tool, the large end of the green stylus, and I'm just making a large dot on both sides. And these are slightly shorter than the white one. They kind of fit in that little nook there. And then I'm using the small end of the green tool to drag the swoosh down. Pretty. And then I'm just gonna add one last little detail at the tip of the pink petal. I'm going to use the green, and I'm just going to do 3 little dots just right at the tip of the pink petal. Okay, and now we're just going to let this dry a little bit before we go on to do the top dots. Okay, now that this has dried for a bit, we are going to do some top dots. So when it comes to top dots, you just want to pick a tool smaller than the original base dot. So I grabbed this 4.5, and you can dot either like in the bottom. I have this photo here of like all of these rocks that I painted when I first started. So as you can see, some of the top dots are like in the clumped together at the base of the larger dot, and then some are in the center. So you can really do it however you want. I think for the one that we're working on, I'm going to do center. So you just want a tool smaller than your base dot. I'm going to use the 4.5, and I'm going to top dot the purple dot, and I'm going to use the blue. So I'm actually just hovering. I'm not pushing all the way down, or else the dot might cover too much of the surface. So I'm just hovering over the top to get a dot that's right in the center of the purple one. And top dots just really add another layer of dimension. I feel like they really bring the mandalas to life. Just gonna wipe my tool off, and then I'm going to top dot on the blue dot using purple and that same tool. Again, I'm not pushing all the way down. I'm just kind of hovering until the dot is the size that I want. I'm going to let these dry again, and then we will do one last top dot using pearl. Okay, so that has now dried for a bit, so I'm going to take the large end of the blue stylus, and I am just going to top dot again. Right in the center of the dots. Okay, and there is our finished design. You can use the same pattern in any other color palette that you want, but this is just a really basic pattern to get you started. So we are going to let this fully dry, and then we can wipe off the guide marks, and then we will varnish, and then we will be done. Okay, this is now dry, so I'm going to take just a Pampers wet wipe. You can just use a wet paper towel or wet cloth, and we are just going to get those guide marks off. And now we're going to apply a varnish. I'm just making sure that that wet wipe residue is off. And then for varnish, I'm just going to use this DuraClear Satin Varnish by DecoArt. I'm just going to brush it on. So I'm just going to pour a little bit. Don't need a ton. And even that was a little bit too much, so I'm just going to wipe off a little bit. And I'm not sure if it's picking up on camera, but a lot of varnishes, when you brush them on, are kind of milky. So it looks like cloudy, but it dries clear. So I'm going to let this dry and then do one more coat to do one more layer. I always end up putting too much of this. A little bit goes a long way with this stuff. I like to get all the edges. I'm also just picking some up because I'm gonna wipe it off. Because it is milky, it's tempting to like want to keep working it in, but promise it dries clear, so you just go lightly over, and then yeah, once it dries, the cloudiness goes away. So we are pretty much done. I will wait for that to dry and then I'll just show you guys a little video of how it looks. And here is the final design. Hope you guys found that helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below, and we will see you in the next video. If you are interested in learning more from me, I teach weekly live classes over on Patreon. Once you become a Patreon subscriber, you will have instant access to a library of all of my past classes. I also share other things on Patreon, such as my color palette recipes and exclusive discount codes to your favorite dotting suppliers. There is also a 24-hour group chat where you can interact with myself and the community and share photos of your work and ask questions. And you will also have access to Patreon Messenger, where you can message me at any time. All right, I hope to see you guys over on Patreon. Details are located in the description of this video.